Welcome to Beverly Review. I'm Josh Gross. Our guest tonight, Governor John Sununu, discusses his new book, The Quiet Man, The Indispensable Presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. Governor Sununu, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
What made you want to write the book, The Quiet Man?
Well, it's almost a quarter century. George Bush hated to brag about himself. I felt a lot of folks did not appreciate the very significant achievements he had. I told him I was going to break a promise to him that I wasn't going to write a book. He was thrilled to hear it. He and Barbara encouraged me, and so I wrote it.
You discuss in the book that you went to have lunch with him not that long ago, and you discussed actually writing the book. And you were initially reluctant to write a book. You said you don't like kiss and tell types books. Now, this is certainly not a kiss and tell book, but it is an insider's account of what went on in the White House. Why is it better, you think, now than if you'd written it right after you left the White House?
Well, there's a perspective, and I can talk about the success, the longevity of the success of some of his achievements. You know, George Bush produced more domestic legislation than any president except Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. And some of that legislation had huge impact. The Clean Air Bill, an amazingly successful and cost-efficient environmental piece of legislation. The legislation George Bush proposed and put in place for deregulating energy, we're benefiting from that now. The Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, these are all pieces of legislation that had huge impacts. When he decided to change the subsidies on agriculture, at least part of them, to incentives for exports, it created a whole new industry, in a sense, for America, the agricultural export business. All of these things had huge impacts on the country, and now with a little bit of looking back over the years, I can say definitively what the positive results were.
We're going to talk more about the book after the break, but and I enjoyed it very much. I think we should probably set up for our viewers a little bit about your political career. So you were a three-term governor of New Hampshire. How did you first get involved in Republican politics in New Hampshire?
By mistake. Really, the beginning was in 1980. There was a Democratic senator that had won post-Watergate, and it looked like he was going to lose. I was teaching at the time at Tufts University. Our primary for a regular election is in September. Faculty don't do very much during the summer. I thought I would join what turned out to be a huge field of Republicans in the primary, led by the Attorney General, former Governor Powell, Speaker of the House, Senate President, a couple of millionaires. It ended up with 11 candidates, one of which was an encyclopedia salesman named Smith and somebody with a funny-looking name like Sununu.
Sununu, yeah.
I came in second to the Attorney General, to Rudman, and he asked me, because he was sort of a moderate Republican, the rest of us were all conservatives, he asked me to chair his campaign for the general election, which I did. He won. I thought that was my fling in politics. You know, I had spent my summer running around doing a primary. But 2 years later, the party asked me to be the sacrificial lamb running against the incumbent Democratic governor that looked like he was going to win by a landslide. I eventually said yes and woke up elected governor one day.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
It is.
Now, you mentioned in 1980 you actually voted for Ronald Reagan. So
I did.
It's very interesting. And you didn't support, and then Ambassador Bush at the time.
I supported Reagan.
Were you at the infamous I paid for this, Mr. Breen debate?
No, I was not, but
Okay.
certainly was watching it on television. And that was the turning point in that election. When I won the primary that we talked about to run for governor, I picked up the phone and called then Vice President Bush, reintroduced myself to him, but we had gotten to know each other a little bit over his 2 years as vice president. Asked him to come up and do a fundraiser because I had no money to run against the incumbent. 11 days later, he came up and we raised the money to run, and we've been close friends ever since.
New Hampshire has obviously a special role in the American political electorate, and it's a role.
It's the way God intended.
Well, the voters take it very seriously in New Hampshire.
They work hard
on both parties.
They work hard.
So, what is that all about? Tell us a little bit about, why is the New Hampshire primary such an important part of the
Well, it's grown into being an important part, and we have a lot of people in politics in New Hampshire. We have 400 members of the House for a state of 1 million. Every city and town is a very significant part of what it costs you to live in New Hampshire. The primary fundraiser taxes in New Hampshire are still property taxes, and they're generally determined by a vote at the town meeting or the school district meeting. So everybody is involved in politics. Statistically speaking, either you, your spouse, or one of your neighbors on the left or right has run for office in your lifetime. And so they take it seriously. During the primary season, the voters in both parties not only go and look at the candidates they like, they go and look at the candidates they're pretty sure they don't like. They're active participants, and they make it work.
Yeah. Our guest is Governor John Sununu, discussing his book, The Quiet Man, The Indispensable Presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. Okay, so back to New Hampshire now. First of all, as a governor, how do you deal with a legislature, at least with one house that has 400 members? I mean, that sounds so unruly to someone here in California. Explain that to me.
400 members in the House and only 24 in the Senate, so we have the biggest House and the smallest Senate. And they're both difficult to deal with. I give new governors one piece of advice. I say, find about $5,000 of free funds you can use and buy coffee and donuts every Thursday. Have it in the great chamber outside of the governor's office and walk around and talk to the members of the House and talk to them and find out what's bothering them. It's really the same in Washington too. If you want to lead, nothing happens in Washington without presidential leadership. And presidential leadership is not just throwing an idea on the table and hoping somebody will pick it up. If you're going to lead, you have to talk to people personally. And you have to convey with them a sense of us rather than me. And that's what George Bush did well. Bill Clinton did it well. Those are the way to get cooperation out of Congress. And that's what I had to do in New Hampshire.
In the book, you talk a lot about how President Bush tried to really develop a relationship with members on both sides of the aisle. And in particular, you talk about the 1990 budget deal, of course, which, of course, didn't go the way you and other conservatives would have liked. But you give a very accurate play-by-play, basically, of how it broke down the way it did. Now, in terms of these relationships, you know, much has been written about that a lot of congressmen don't live in Washington anymore. They don't bring their families to Washington. Do you think that contributes in part to the gridlock?
Not necessarily. You know, they're there for half the week at least, 3, 4 days, 5 days. There's interaction during that time. I'm talking about a president inviting him down to the White House. Dan Rostenkowski was the Democratic chairman of the Ways and Means Committee while we were putting the budget together. We had him down for about 24 meetings, one-on-one with the president, trying to work out the differences. And we did. And you mentioned it wasn't necessarily a very popular budget package when it was passed. The president had to deal with a House that had 260 to 175 Democrats controlled by Democratic Speaker Foley, 55-45 in the Senate controlled by Democratic Senate Leader George Mitchell. They were determined to make him pay the political penalty for having said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and perhaps winning on that phrase. So they made it clear, you're not getting a multi-year budget, which the country needed. Savings and loan crisis had tanked the real estate market. He just sent young men and women to the Middle East to kick Saddam Hussein out. He couldn't take a defense sequester. He really needed a multi-year budget. They made it clear you're not getting it without paying the penalty, a ransom of having to accept taxes. And so we negotiated a package. The taxes in the first package were gasoline tax increase, gasoline tax,
consumption type taxes,
which had not been adjusted for inflation in nearly a decade. It was going to happen. The president got 3.5 times the size of the tax increase. He got 3.5 times that in spending cuts. But more importantly, we got rules, a cap on the growth of spending. You had to, any new program had to be justified against the revenue, pay as you go. And those rules, with what the budget itself was, produced the surpluses and the growth of the 90s that the Clintons like to take credit for. That was George Herbert Walker Bush taking the political pain to get a budget package the country needed to produce the surpluses and the growth that everybody enjoyed.
The one thing I love about the book is, you know, you talk about things that happened in the late 80s, early 90s, and then you sort of bring it back to today and talk about what happened to some of these people and where they ended up and so forth. Let's talk about the Clintons for a second, who you mentioned. Of course, New Hampshire made Bill Clinton the comeback kid, or so it was said at the time. When you saw that happen and you had just left the White House at that point, could you see that, you know, Bill Clinton was really on a trajectory to become a major figure in national politics?
Yeah, I knew Bill Clinton very well. We were governors together. He was chairman of the National Governors Association when I was the vice chairman. Then I became chairman. He chaired some of the committees for me. Bill Clinton always had a fire in his belly to be president. And in the period of early 1990 going into 91, as we were talking about who the nominee might be on the Democratic side, everybody was talking Mario Cuomo.
Mario Cuomo, and you talked about that.
I was positive it was going to be Bill Clinton because Cuomo wanted to be coronated.
Sure.
Clinton would fight for it.
Right.
And I wasn't surprised when he came second in New Hampshire to Paul Tsongas, who was the favorite son from Massachusetts. So that's in essence winning, and went on to win. And Clinton was a shrewd politician. He loved politics. He loved being the center of attention. He knew how to use the power of office well, and he knew how to spend political capital and interact with people to get things done. That's what you need. And surprisingly enough, although he wasn't as gregarious and as outspoken, that's how George Herbert Walker Bush functioned. And certainly on what he did in foreign policy was the result of his personal interactions and relationships and the way he dealt with people. And the great success he had on all his domestic legislation with a heavily democratically controlled Congress was because this was somebody who knew how to sit down and make it a win-win situation for the people he was dealing with.
When we were just warming up here on set, you mentioned that you've read other accounts and they're not always entirely accurate. So again, do you feel that with the passage of time, that's allowed you to really sort of process? Because when you're operating as White House Chief of Staff, it's 1,000,000 miles an hour every day, right? So I mean, a little time to decompress and sort of look back on it. Is that something you think we see in the book?
Well, I think what you see in the book is, and I'm told it's really the first insider's discussion of what's going on in the White House since Haldeman wrote his diary, which is a fantastic book, by the way. Not many.
Is that a conservative saying good things about?
No, but Haldeman went home every night. I don't know how.
Wrote down,
wrote it down, and it's a huge book, and it has a CD which is about 8 times the volume of what's in the book.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it's really insightful.
Yeah.
You don't have to agree with it, but it talks to you about the details of what's happening. I tried to write that kind of a book here in terms of the details of what's happening. I'm told by liberals and conservatives alike, they like the book, they like the man, and they like the inside politics that's discussed in it.
Did you have a role model as Chief of Staff?
Well, remember, there was another Chief of Staff from New Hampshire, Sherman Adams, and I knew Sherm. He
was Eisenhower's Chief of Staff?
Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, and came back and got back into the ski industry. And I met Sherm and talked to him, never even thinking that I would...
That would ever be in your future, right?
It would ever be in my future. Yeah. But you don't have a role model because the job of Chief of Staff is what that particular president wants it to be. So you can't model yourself. You got to find out what the boss wants, and that's what you do.
But having been an executive and a governor,
right,
obviously that's an obvious skill set, particularly with regard to dealing with the press, dealing with other elected officials, and so forth. So, I mean, that was pretty much the perfect background, wouldn't you say, to go into it?
Yeah. I really do believe, having gone through an election process, Sam Rayburn says, you show me someone who's at least been elected sheriff, and I'll show you somebody who understands what's going on. One of the jobs of Chief of Staff is being willing to step in front of the arrows that might be aimed at your boss. And I had been governor, and I knew that I would like my staff to do that. And so I accepted that. I knew that when I went down to Washington. It goes with the territory. And if you're going to do your job well, you'll probably end up being the guy they don't like, and your boss will be the guy they love.
That's a sign you're doing what you're supposed to be doing,
and
right?
that shows you what you're doing right.
You got it. All right, we're going to take a break. More with Governor John Sununu after this.
Body language can tell you all sorts of things. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911 and get them to a hospital immediately. Learn the body language and spot a stroke fast.
So who's going to do what?
I'll pack the dead batteries.
Great.
I'll only put what I don't need into a duffel bag.
Perfect. That's totally unhelpful.
No problem.
Meanwhile, I will try to comfort everyone by speaking in a calm voice.
And who is going to handle supplies?
I can forget to do a list for us.
Thanks, pal.
We couldn't be any less prepared. I'm proud of you guys.
Talk to your kids about who to call, where to meet, what to pack. Visit ready.gov/kids for tips and information.
We're back on Beverly Hills View with Governor John Sununu discussing his new book, The Quiet Man, The Indispensable Presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. Governor Sununu, so we were talking about your career as a governor of New Hampshire and also in New Hampshire politics. New Hampshire is going to play a major role in this upcoming presidential election. Evaluate the Republican field for us. I know everybody asks you that, but I want to ask you too.
You know, it's a good field. I'm partial to governors and former governors. I really think the experience of having to work with a legislature and having to take the positions that are clearly focused on you, you're not hiding behind everybody else in the legislative body, is an important part of getting there. That doesn't mean you can't be president if you're not, but I lean towards them. There's a handful of good ones running on the Republican side. There's one or two good senators. I think from this 5, 6, 7 at the top, what they're going to do is mature as they go through the process of running. There's a lot of education in the process of running. You sharpen up your agenda. As I talk about it in the book, that's where George Bush got a very good sense of what he wanted to accomplish. And so the process, I hope, will do what it's supposed to do. And that's filter from those that should be considered the one that should get the nomination.
Now, what do you make of the Donald Trump phenomenon?
Well, you know, this is the season in politics where noise triumphs. And the loudest and the noisiest gets people's attention. After the kids go back to school, I think the electorate starts getting serious, starts looking at the fact that they need somebody that can handle the job, that has the demeanor for the job, and would be respected by other leaders of the world while he's in the job, and would have the experience of making a Congress move in the right direction. Bluff and bluster does not work with Congress, and I think it's a big problem.
Your neighbor in Vermont, Bernie Sanders, is, as of this morning, it's appearing to be polling very well in New Hampshire. Now, tell us a little bit about that. And obviously, you don't know as much about the other side of the aisle. But do you think Bernie Sanders is going to have a good run in this primary?
He will. Bernie is now the beneficiary of the anybody but Hillary votes. I don't think too many of the leaders of the Democratic Party either think he's going to win the nomination or want him to win the nomination. He's run on the socialist ticket, be an easy target for Republicans, but he's sort of the stalking horse now. And if there's going to be an alternate to Hillary Clinton, it'll probably be Joe Biden or John Kerry, somebody that has run before.
And a little more national stature.
Yeah, because they're going to come in late. Which means there's not going to be as long a learning curve for them. And so they'll, I think, lean towards somebody who's either been on the ticket like John Kerry or been on a ticket as vice president like Joe Biden.
Now, New Hampshire is interesting in the sense that nationally, at least in 5 out of 6 of the last elections, it's been a blue state. But in terms of the state legislature and local politics, Republicans are very strong in the state. What's the roadmap for California, you think, to rebuild the Republican Party here? As you know, California once had a very strong Republican Party, and in the last election, no Republicans were elected to statewide office. So what's the roadmap?
You've got to stop the party infighting. You cannot beat the Democrats with a divided Republican Party. And it just needs leadership, internal leadership. It has to have adult supervision and then has to mend its own fences, come to a point where you can focus and emphasize what everyone agrees on, leave the things that you're divided on for later. And
so does that mean more openness on the social issues, you think? Or?
It means that the social issues are not the election issues of the day. It means that the economic issues are the issues you get elected on. It means the budget issues are the issues that you get elected on. It means, if you will, ceding control to the employees' unions, public employee unions, is an issue that you get elected on. You really have to deal with that. It means dealing with your infrastructure needs, because that's an economic and a growth issue. It means putting an agenda together that stops the hemorrhaging of investment out of this state. Look, you've become the punching bag for the other 49. Even Alaska is poaching here. And you've become a caricature of yourself.
Well, and even a lot of Democrats will say they don't like the one-party state either, because there's not the kind of debate and thing that used to go on.
In other words, I say the party's got to go back and knit its strength on the economic growth and basic issues like that, and stop the squabbling on the fringe issues.
Now, but one thing that's very different in this book, particularly when you compare it to today, is at the time George Herbert Walker Bush was elected, there wasn't red state, blue state. I mean, it wasn't this very predictable breakdown that happens in almost every state and almost every national election. Where did that come from? I mean, why?
Well, it was there, but we didn't talk about it. The southern states for a long time were all solid Democrat states.
Right.
Then they became solid Republican states, but they had a characteristic to them. The Northeast was always the liberal, perhaps the moderate Republican region. So there were labels, not necessarily the stark red or blue, but states were characterized.
But what do you make that, again, in at least the last 5 or 6 elections, there's almost a very predictable breakdown of maybe 5 or 6 states change hands, but for the most part, that's what it is.
I think it's because the parties work them that way, and they become turnout-oriented rather than issue-oriented results. And I think the Democrats have done a much better job than Republicans, at least in the last 2, 3, 4 elections, in getting their voters to the polls on presidential elections.
But again, at the legislature levels, the Republicans are definitely leading there.
Well, there's an interest. I think my numbers are right. I may be off 1 or 2, but I believe there's 31 Republican governors. I think about 30 or 31 Republicans control the House and the Senate in 30 or 31 states. They have 35, I think, Senates in their control, 35 Houses in control, and 31 places where they're both. That's a dominant control of the political apparatus in the country in the hands of the Republicans.
Absolutely.
But the Democrats do a good job in presidential elections.
Hold on, and also a farm team of candidates coming up the ranks.
That's right. Well, that's why we have 17 running. Everybody coming up the ranks wants to be at the top of the list now.
Okay, so fast forward to 2016. Let's assume it's Hillary Clinton and a prominent Republican. What's the race, and what are the 3 or 4 states you think that will really make a difference in this?
Interesting statistic. Since 1952, no party has controlled the White House for more than 8 years except once. That's George Herbert Walker Bush.
Right, and you mentioned that,
Right. It's 8 years of Obama. The pendulum and the pressure will be going in the other direction. If the Republicans don't blow it, if they don't end up with a farce like Perot, I think destiny, historic reality, the pressure of cleaning out the White House, whatever you want to call it, means that the favorite should be the Republican nominee.
Still going to come down to Ohio, Virginia, Florida, Nevada.
Right.
And again, that's very different than the race you guys ran, at least in 1988. Certainly.
Well,
New Jersey was a
we won
Republican
40
state.
states, I think.
Right. And reading it today, again, it does read a little interesting, particularly what's happened. But there's a lot of very important history in the book. And I think we were discussing on set that, at least for history's sake, you had to write it. And obviously, the president was in support of the book, and he told you to go for it. So.
Right. I just wanted to get his domestic achievements in particular between the 2 covers of a book so that the historians who seem to have been turning a blind eye, been myopic to what he accomplished, at least had to go and deal with this reality that was there.
Sure.
And the legislative record is really unbelievable. And certainly what he did in nurturing the collapse of the Soviet Union and kicking Saddam out of Kuwait are his foreign policy achievements. And so the whole ball of wax is there, and the personalities that helped him do it, and both the tug and pulls in the right direction and the wrong direction are discussed.
Is in there. Now, 2 of your sons have been very involved in New Hampshire politics. Let's talk about that a little bit. Chris is on the executive council, right? Sort of like the board of supervisors here. It's a unique to New Hampshire governing model. Tell us a little bit about it.
Five members of the council elected from 5 districts in the state. Every gubernatorial appointment has to be approved by the council. Every contract in the state, I think now, there used to be 5,000 when I was governor. It's now every contract over 10,000 gets a public hearing in front of the council and the governor. And has a problem.
It'd be pretty amazing, yeah.
And they have to approve it.
Yeah. And so a lot of executive, obviously, experience and other stuff. What do they ask you about politics? What do you tell them about politics in either direction? What's most different now than when you were in elected office?
There's a funny story that when George W. was running for president and my son was running for the Senate, I got together with George Herbert Walker Bush, and we talked about the fact that we quite often sit next to the phone and waiting for it to ring, but it never rings.
That's a good sign.
And we don't get asked for advice.
Right. Well, but having grown up around it, they know much more than they think they do.
They do. Yeah. They've stuffed envelopes. They've knocked on doors. They have a sense of, and New Hampshire is a local control state. So there's politics, as we talked about earlier, oozes out of everything. So they've grown up in that environment.
Would you also say that it's pretty much the same mechanics to get elected today in New Hampshire that it was.
It is, and you know the nice thing about their interest in politics is we have a saying in the family: we tithe our time. You're really a private sector person, but every once in a while you got to contribute a little back to the system, spend a little bit of time, go do something, then come back to the private sector and let somebody else, you know, have the fun of being in office. We don't have any. There's no long-term ambition. There's a commitment to service, and I think that's probably the nice thing about the way New Hampshire functions. It's a self-governing state in that respect. People give a little bit of their time and their talent, and they come back to what they're doing.
And they see it. Our last question for John Sununu. What one thing do you really want people to know about President H.W. Bush, and what one misconception maybe do you want to clear up?
He did more in his 4 years than virtually any other president has done in its 8 years, other than the giants like a Franklin Roosevelt. His domestic record was as good as his foreign policy, and he proves that a good president can make a difference for America and the world.
The book is The Quiet Man, The Indispensable Presidency of George H.W. Bush. Governor Sununu, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Thanks. We'll see you next time on Beverly Hills News.